A freed Black River pilot named Solomon Pace navigates the lower Mississippi in the 1830s to 1840s, losing 5 keelboats to hidden underwater snags over a decade of commercial hauling. After the 5th sinking, he begins constructing a hand-drawn obstruction map from memory, dead reckoning, and weighted line soundings. The most accurate survey of the river's submerged hazards ever assembled by a single person. He presents it twice to the Army Corps of Engineers at their New Orleans office. Both times it is received without acknowledgement. In 1844, a nearly identical map is published under the name of a white government surveyor, Lieutenant Elias Drummond, and adopted as the official federal navigation chart for the lower Mississippi. Solomon Pace dies in 1851. His original map, folded inside an oilskin pouch, is discovered in 1962 inside the wall cavity of a demolished river warehouse in Natchez. Dated, signed, and 11 months older than Drummond's published version. Crisis opening. The water gave no warning. It never did on the lower Mississippi. Not in October. Not in the flat gray stretches below Natchez, where the current ran slow and deceptively shallow, and the sandbars migrated 6 feet overnight, without leaving a single ripple on the surface to mark where they had moved. Solomon Pace had been reading this river for 11 years by the time the Eliza Coburn went down, and still it surprised him. That was the thing about the Mississippi that no amount of experience fully corrected. It was not a river in the way a man from the Ohio Valley understood a river. It was a living geologic argument, a 2,300-mile disagreement between water and land that the land was slowly losing, and it kept its own calendar, its own logic, and its own dead. The Eliza Coburn struck the Snag at approximately 4 in the afternoon on October 14th, 1839. Solomon was at the sweep oar on the starboard side, working a wide, cautious arc around the eastern bank near Ellis Cliffs, a limestone bluff formation that threw long shadows across the water in autumn light and made depth judgment nearly impossible after 3 in the afternoon. The boat carried 1,400 pounds of salted pork, 200 pounds of seed cotton, 3 crates of cast iron cookware, and 2 passengers, a land speculator named Morse and his teenage son, both asleep below deck when the hull found the tree. It was not a small tree. That was the first thing Solomon registered. Not the sound of impact, which was more a deep structural groan than a crash, but the size of the thing underneath them. The bow rose slightly before the port side caved inward, suggesting an object of significant mass anchored at an angle in the riverbed. Later, hauling himself out of 9 feet of water onto a mudflat 40 yards downstream, he would calculate the submerged trunk at roughly 60 feet long, and perhaps 4 feet in diameter at the root mass. A cypress, almost certainly. The river had probably taken it from the western bank during the floods of 1836 or 1837, carried it 40 or 50 miles downstream, and buried the root end in the silt at an angle of perhaps 30 degrees, invisible from the surface, immovable by current, and positioned with almost geometrical precision across the only navigable channel through that particular bend. The Eliza Coburn sank in under 4 minutes. Both passengers survived. The cargo did not. Morse stood on the mudflat in his shirt sleeves, watching the last crate disappear into brown water, and said nothing. His son was shaking. Solomon was already counting. he counted 5. The Hannah Grace in 1828, taken by a root mass near Palmyra Bend. The Redbird in 1831, hull sprung on a submerged bar 3 miles below Grand Gulf. The Providence II in 1834, lost in the deep bend above Rodney Landing, where the channel narrowed to 80 yards, and the current dropped to almost nothing, and sediment piled up in configurations that moved every spring. The James Coulter in 1837, striking an object near Ellis Cliffs that Solomon had noted in his memory and reported to the boat's owner, who had noted it too and done nothing. And now the Eliza Coburn at Ellis Cliffs again, on an obstacle that may or may not have been the same one that took the James Coulter 2 years before. 5 boats, 5 snags. Not one of them marked on any chart he had ever been given, purchased, or borrowed. Not one of them buoyed, flagged, or removed by any federal authority. Roughly $14,000 in total cargo losses at market prices. And 11 years of work in a river that the United States government had formally declared in legislation passed in 1824 to be its navigational responsibility. He reached into his coat. The oilskin notebook was still there, soaked through but intact. He had carried it for 3 years without explaining it to anyone. He opened it, found a page toward the back that had stayed dry inside the double-folded cover, and began to write. Not about the boat, about the tree, its location, its probable dimensions, its angle of anchor, the depth of water above the root mass, the way the current behaved in the 50 yards approaching it, flattening slightly, losing speed, carrying a faint surface disturbance at low water that a man who knew to look for it might possibly recognize as a warning. Morse watched him write. After a while, he asked what Solomon was doing. Solomon said he was making a note. Morse looked at the notebook, then at the river, then at Solomon. He said nothing more. He had just lost $900 in cargo on a river that the government was supposed to have surveyed. He did not appear to connect those two facts. Solomon did. Background. Solomon Pace had been born free in Natchez, Mississippi in 1805. This required documentary proof at almost every significant moment of his adult life, and he carried it accordingly. A certificate of freedom issued by Adams County and signed by a magistrate named Whitfield, folded inside the same oilskin pouch as his notebook, soft at the creases from years of opening and refolding in front of men who needed to be shown before they would proceed. His father, Ezra Pace, had been a free black carpenter who built and repaired flatboats along the Natchez waterfront from approximately 1795 until his death in 1819. His mother Clara had died when Solomon was 4. He learned what he knew from work, from observation, and from a small number of discarded books and manuals he found in river warehouses over the years, reading them slowly in winter months by lamp. He started as a deckhand at 13. By 16, he was working as a rope man on flatboats, running the Natchez to New Orleans stretch. By 19, he had taught himself dead reckoning from a navigation manual he found in a warehouse on Silver Street, its cover torn off and its first 30 pages missing, covering the remaining chapters over the course of a single winter until he could close the book and reconstruct every calculation from memory. He learned by doing what the manual described, estimating his position from a known point, using speed, heading, and elapsed time, and checking his results against the landmarks he passed. he was rarely off by more than 80 yards in a mile. Within 2 years, he was never off by more than 40. The Mississippi River of the 1820s and 1830s was not a federally managed waterway in any meaningful sense. The Army Corps of Engineers had been given authority over river navigation improvements under the General Survey Act of 1824. But their resources were thin, their surveys were intermittent, and their attention concentrated on harbor improvements near major port cities. The lower Mississippi between Natchez and Vicksburg, 120 miles of some of the most commercially active keelboat traffic in the country, had received exactly one partial hydrographic survey between 1824 and 1839. A junior officer named Treadwell conducted it in 1831. It covered roughly 40 miles of the eastern bank channel. It missed, by Solomon's later accounting, at least 23 significant submerged obstacles. Between 1810 and 1840, the Army Corps received 847 written reports of keelboat and flatboat losses on the lower Mississippi. Of those, 612, roughly 72%, cited submerged snags or unmarked sandbars as the primary cause. The Corps acknowledged these reports. It commissioned a study in 1835. The study recommended expanded survey work. The funding was not approved. Those 847 reports represented not just property losses, but deaths. 34 documented drowning fatalities in that same 30-year window, and an unknown number of undocumented ones. Because keelboat crews who drowned on the lower Mississippi in the 1820s were not always the kind of men whose deaths generated paperwork. Solomon knew none of those aggregate figures in 1839. But he had lived their arithmetic across 5 boats, and he had arrived, alone, without instruction, without anyone suggesting it was possible, at a conclusion the Army Corps had not formally reached. The snag problem was not random. It was geographic. The obstructions concentrated in specific formations. The deep outside bends where current velocity dropped and sediment accumulated. The channel convergence points where debris collected. The limestone shelf formations like Ellis Cliffs, where the riverbed changed depth abruptly and tree roots found purchase in the rock. If you knew those formations, and if you had recorded every loss at them over sufficient time, you could build a map. Not a perfect map, but a map accurate enough that no pilot who used it would lose a boat to a hazard that could have been marked. He had been building it in his head since 1831. He had been writing pieces of it in his notebook since 1836. Sitting on a mud flat in October light with the Eliza Coburn somewhere beneath 9 feet of brown water behind him, he decided that thinking in fragments were no longer sufficient. The problem. The first obstacle was not cartographic, it was material. A proper hydrographic survey of the lower Mississippi required a vessel, a crew of at least 6 standardized sounding equipment, a transit instrument for angular measurement, a trained draftsman, federal authorization, and the implicit social permission granted to white government employees to move through southern river towns, taking measurements and asking questions, without being required to produce identification at every dock. Solomon Pace had none of those things. What he had was a 50-foot length of knotted rope with a lead sinker salvaged from the Eliza Coburn's rigging before she went under. An oilskin notebook. 11 years of memorized river observations. A working knowledge of dead reckoning and geometric estimation, and the willingness to spend the next several years doing what no federal agency had managed to do with substantially greater resources. He had one additional advantage that no government surveyor had ever possessed on that stretch of river. He was known. Not known as a licensed operator or a credit-worthy businessman, not in any category the law recognized. Known the way a free black man in Natchez became known after 2 decades of waterfront work. Known to the dockmen and warehouse keepers, the ferry operators and fish traders who worked the river's edge before first light, the flatboat crews who wintered near Natchez. These men knew where every sunken boat lay. They knew which bends had taken 2 boats in the same season, which bars shifted in flood years and which were permanent, which stretches of river had killed men within living memory. They had been accumulating this knowledge the same way Solomon had, through loss, through years of close attention, and nobody had ever asked them to write it down. He began asking in November 1839. He started at the south end of Natchez waterfront, working through men he knew, following introductions to men he didn't. He was not conducting a formal survey. He was having conversations. He carried his notebook and he listened. And when a man described a location with enough precision, a specific bend, a named landmark, a distance from a creek mouth he could verify, he recorded it. When a description was vague, he asked questions until it sharpened, or until it became clear the knowledge was secondhand. One afternoon in December, a flatboat pilot named Cutter, a white man 50 years old who had run this river since before Solomon was born, sat down across from him at a table near the Natchez landing and spent 2 hours describing obstructions he had memorized over 30 years. He drew shapes and spilled water on the table to indicate the angles of submerged trunks. He named 4 locations that Solomon had never encountered, and 2 that precisely matched losses Solomon had personally witnessed. At the end of the conversation, Cutter looked at Solomon's notebook and asked what he intended to do with it. Solomon said he intended to give it to the Army Corps of Engineers. Cutter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They won't use it." Solomon asked why. Cutter picked up his cup. "Because if they use it, they have to explain why they didn't do it themselves." He stood up, nodded once, and walked back to his boat. Solomon wrote that down too. By spring of 1840, he had collected 67 separate reports, covering approximately 90 miles of river. He cross-referenced each against his own observations, discarded 14 he could not verify, and retained 53. He transferred them to a single large sheet of paper, not a printed chart. He had no access to one at that scale, but a hand-drafted grid constructed with a borrowed ruler and a series of proportional calculations that translated river distances into paper distances with reasonable accuracy. It took 4 months to produce the first complete draft. It covered 80 miles of river and marked 53 confirmed obstructions, each with a notation indicating depth, probable size, and year of first documented impact. It was the most detailed Snag survey of that stretch of river that existed anywhere on Earth. First attempt. The Army Corps of Engineers New Orleans District Office occupied the 2nd floor of a commercial building on Chupatula Street, 3 blocks from the riverfront. Solomon arrived on a Tuesday morning in August 1840. He had spent the previous afternoon locating the building, confirming its hours from a dock worker who knew it, and pressing his coat. He carried his certificate of freedom. he carried his map. The clerk at the front desk was a young man named Hargrove. The name was on a small plate on his desk, the kind of plate that announced its owner's right to occupy a desk in a government office. Hargrove looked at Solomon with an expression Solomon had learned to read precisely over 35 years. Not hostility exactly, but a particular variety of administrative confusion, as though Solomon's presence in that office represented a category of problem for which no procedure had been written. Solomon stated his purpose clearly and without elaboration. He was a river pilot. He had navigated the lower Mississippi between Natchez and Vicksburg for 11 years. He had compiled a survey of submerged snags and obstructions covering 80 miles and 53 confirmed hazard locations. He wished to present it to the appropriate officer for consideration. Hargrove asked if he had an appointment. He did not. Hargrove said that Major Calloway, the district engineer, received visitors by appointment only. He could, if Solomon wished, accept the map as a written submission and place it in the correspondence file for the Major's review. How long does that review typically take? Hargrove said he could not say with certainty. Several months, perhaps. Solomon set the map on the desk. He had made a copy. He watched Hargrove place it in a wooden tray without looking at it. He walked back down the stairs and into the August heat on Chupatula Street, past the smell of the river 2 blocks away, and booked passage north. 8 months passed. No response came. Second attempt. In April 1841, Solomon returned to New Orleans with an updated map. 64 confirmed obstructions now. Coverage extended to 94 miles. He had written ahead in February a formal letter to Major Calloway's office describing his work and requesting a meeting. No reply had come, but he went anyway. Hargrove did not appear to remember him. Solomon produced his letter. Hargrove checked a log, confirmed the letter had been received and filed, and informed Solomon that Major Calloway was presently in Washington. A Lieutenant Ashford was available for brief consultations on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. It was Wednesday. Solomon returned Thursday. Ashford received him in a small room with one window overlooking a courtyard. He was perhaps 27, with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised to believe in politeness to all persons, and was now being required to apply that principle under conditions his upbringing had not anticipated. He studied Solomon's map for 4 minutes. He asked how Solomon had taken his soundings, how he had established position references, what instruments he had used. Solomon described each method: the knotted rope and lead sinker, the dead reckoning from named landmarks and creek mouths, the cross-referencing of his own observations against the testimony of pilots he knew and trusted. He said his positional accuracy was likely within 50 to 100 yards for most entries, less precise than transit-equipped survey work, but sufficient for practical navigation warnings. Ashford looked at the map again. He said the work appeared thorough and that he would bring it to Major Calloway's attention upon his return. He said the Corps was presently prioritizing harbor work in the New Orleans district. Upper River survey work was not currently a funded line. The first map I submitted, Solomon said, 8 months ago. Has it been reviewed? Ashford said he was not aware of a previous submission. He would check the correspondence files. Solomon walked back to the docks in the August heat. He did not know that Ashford would be transferred to Savannah within 6 weeks. He did not know that Major Calloway, returning from Washington, would be immediately assigned to a levee project near Baton Rouge that would consume his office entirely for the following year. He did not know that both of his submitted maps would sit in the Corps' correspondence files, unfiled and unindexed, until the clerk who needed the space moved them to a storage room in a building on Magazine Street where they would remain, untouched, for the next 121 years. He knew only that the river was still taking boats, that his map was more accurate than anything the federal government had produced for that water, and that no one in an official capacity appeared to intend to do anything about either of those facts. He went home and kept working. Escalation. By the winter of 1842, Solomon's survey covered 110 miles and 79 confirmed obstructions. He had refined his sounding technique. A second weighted line of different length allowed depth triangulation at points where current made single-line readings unreliable. He had developed a notation system that recorded not just location, but probable orientation, depth range, and seasonal variability, which snags shifted with spring floods, which were anchored year-round. He had also begun sharing the map, not the original, hand-copied excerpts, section by section, given to pilots he trusted. He charged nothing. He asked only that any pilot who found an error or located a new obstruction not on his copy send word back through the informal communication network of dock workers and ferrymen and river traders who moved information along the Mississippi with a reliability that no postal system had matched. 6 pilots sent corrections or additions in 1842. 4 more in 1843. By early 1844, Solomon had a working document refined by the practical experience of at least a dozen men who navigated that water professionally. The original 53 Snag map had been one man's memory and observation. The 1844 version, 89 confirmed obstructions across 115 miles, with seasonal notations, depth ranges, and pilot-verified position references, was something qualitatively different. It was a collective instrument, built from the accumulated knowledge of men who had no institutional standing and no academic credentials, whose combined experience on that river exceeded anything the Army Corps of Engineers had deployed in that district in the previous decade. In February 1844, Solomon made a clean final copy on 4 sheets of heavy paper. He wrote the legend by hand, explaining each notation. He dated it February 14th, 1844. At the bottom of the 4th sheet, he signed it. Solomon Pace, Natchez, Adams County, Mississippi. River pilot, free man. He folded it into the oilskin pouch. He was 39 years old. He had been building this map for 8 years. He intended to make one final attempt to bring it before someone with authority to use it. What he did not yet know was that somewhere in the Army Corps' New Orleans district office, a lieutenant he had never met was already preparing his own publication, and it would appear in print before Solomon could make his 3rd visit. The publication announcement appeared in the New Orleans Commercial Bulletin on March 11, 1844. It occupied 4 column inches on page 3, beneath a notice about cotton brokerage rates and above an advertisement for river insurance. The headline read, Army Corps releases certified navigation chart for Lower Mississippi Corridor. The accompanying text described the new federal chart as the product of thorough and methodical hydrographic survey work conducted under the authority of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and credited its primary cartographer as First Lieutenant Elias Drummond, a attached to the New Orleans district office since November 1842. Solomon Pace read it in Natchez on a Thursday morning. He had bought the paper from a dock trader who carried it north by steamboat. He sat at a work table in his rented room on Silver Street, the same room where he had spent 3 winters working through a navigation manual with its cover torn off, and he read the 4 column inches twice. Then he set the paper down and looked at the wall for a period of time he could not afterward have accurately estimated. The chart covered 98 miles of the lower Mississippi between Natchez and a point 20 miles south of Vicksburg. It marked 74 submerged snag locations. It used a notation system indicating approximate depth, probable obstruction size, and the degree of seasonal variability at each marked point. Solomon opened his oilskin notebook and found the February 14th copy. He began comparing positions. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon without standing up. By 2 o'clock, he had cross-referenced 41 locations. 37 of them appeared on both documents, within 60 to 120 yards of each other, using notation conventions that were not identical, but were structurally similar enough that a man who had seen his map before constructing his own would have found the resemblance unremarkable. Lieutenant Drummond's chart marked 2 snag positions that Solomon had not recorded. Solomon's map marked 54 additional locations that Drummond's chart did not include. He set the 2 documents side by side on the table. 37 confirmed snags, the same river, the same stretch, the same depth ranges, the same seasonal notation structure. He was 40 miles from New Orleans, and Lieutenant Drummond's chart was already in print. The mechanics of what had happened were not, in retrospect, difficult to reconstruct. It required only the willingness to reason from evidence, rather than from the assumption that institutions behave in the manner they claim to behave. Solomon had submitted 2 maps to the Army Corps' New Orleans district office, one in August 1840, one in April 1841. Both submissions had been accepted by Hargrove. Both had been placed in the correspondence tray. Both had at some point been moved to a storage room on Magazine Street. But somewhere between the correspondence tray and the storage room, someone had looked at them. Not Major Calloway. Calloway had been in Washington in April 1841 and consumed by the Baton Rouge levee project for the following 12 months. Not Lieutenant Ashford, who had transferred to Savannah in June 1841 without, as far as Solomon could determine, ever having reviewed the first submission, but someone. The district office employed 4 clerks, 2 junior draftsmen, and a rotating roster of junior lieutenants assigned to paperwork review. The Corps had been under increasing congressional pressure since 1842 to produce navigable waters documentation for the lower Mississippi. That pressure had a name attached to it, a Senate resolution, introduced in January 1842, directing the War Department to submit a comprehensive snag hazard report for the western rivers within 24 months. 24 months from January 1842 was January 1844. Drummond's chart appeared in March 1844. 2 months late. Close enough. Solomon did not know all of these details in the spring of 1844. He assembled them over the following 3 years, piece by piece, through conversations with dock workers, river traders, and 2 former Corps employees he located through the network of men who worked the New Orleans waterfront, men who knew things about the office on Chupatula Street. that did not appear in any official correspondence. What he assembled was not proof in the legal sense. It was the kind of evidence that builds a picture from its edges inward. The date Drummond arrived at the New Orleans District Office, the date the Senate resolution was passed, the date the chart was submitted for publication, the names of the clerks who had managed the correspondence files during the relevant period. One of those clerks was a man named Pettigrew, who had left the Corps' employment in late 1843 to take a position with a private river insurance firm. Solomon found him in 1847, working an office 2 streets from the levee. He did not accuse Pettigrew of anything. He asked in the careful and precise manner he had developed over years of conversing with men who required information to be requested rather than demanded, whether Pettigrew recalled anything about a submitted survey document from a private individual in the years 1840 or 1841. Pettigrew was a small man with careful eyes. He looked at Solomon for a moment. Then he said that the office received a great many documents, and he could not be expected to remember every piece of correspondence from 3 years prior. Solomon said he understood entirely. He asked whether Pettigrew recalled a map, hand-drawn, covering approximately 80 miles of river, submitted by a pilot from Natchez. Pettigrew said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said that submitted documents became the property of the Corps upon receipt, and that any use of information contained in such documents for official purposes would have been entirely regular and appropriate. He said this the way a man says something he has prepared to say, not the way a man says something he is thinking for the first time. Solomon thanked him and left. He had his answer. Not a confession. An answer. Lieutenant Elias Drummond was 29 years old when his chart was published. He'd graduated from West Point in 1839. The same year, Solomon Pace was hauling himself out of 9 feet of brown water onto a mud flat near Ellis Cliffs. He had been assigned to the New Orleans district in November 1842, 14 months before the chart's publication, and had been given a specific mandate: produce a navigable waters document for the lower Mississippi corridor sufficient to satisfy the Senate's 24-month directive. 14 months was not enough time to conduct a proper hydrographic survey of 98 miles of river. A proper survey of that scope, with full instrumentation crew and sequential work cycles adjusted for seasonal flood variation, would have required 3 to 4 field seasons, roughly 18 to 24 months of active work, plus additional time for drafting and review. Drummond had a transit instrument, a Corps survey vessel, 2 trained oarsmen, and a draftsman named Brossard. He conducted 4 field expeditions between January and December of 1843, totaling approximately 34 days on the river. 34 days, 98 miles. His raw field notes, which Solomon never saw but which another former Corps employee described to him a decade later, covered approximately 40 miles of direct observation with usable positional data. The remaining 58 miles were represented by data that couldn't have been gathered in 34 field days by a 2-vessel crew working against spring current with a single transit instrument. Drummond's chart marked 74 obstructions on 98 miles of river. 37 of those 74 appeared within navigational tolerances on the map Solomon Pace had submitted to that same office 2 and 3 years earlier. The math was not subtle, but math requires a witness, and the only witnesses who might have spoken, Hargrove, Pettigrew, whatever junior officer had reviewed the correspondence file, had institutional reasons to say nothing, social reasons to say nothing, and the additional protection of working within an organization whose internal records were not subject to any outside scrutiny. Solomon had none of those protections. He had a map dated and signed on February 14, 1844. Drummond's chart had been submitted for publication on a date that Solomon spent months trying to establish through indirect inquiry. The best estimate he arrived at was early January 1844, which placed Solomon's signed copy 11 months after Drummond's submission, if the submission date was accurate, or 5 to 6 weeks before Drummond's publication date, if the submission date reflected delay. The question of which came first required knowing exactly when Drummond had submitted his finished document. That date was inside a federal file in a Corps district office on Chupatula Street. Solomon Pace, a free black man in the American South in 1844, had no mechanism to access it. He knew what he knew. He wrote it in his notebook, in the same precise manner in which he had recorded the dimensions of submerged cypress trees and the geometry of sediment formations. He recorded it not because he expected anyone to act on it. He recorded it because the record was accurate, and accuracy was not something he had learned to make conditional on its utility. He considered his options with the same methodical temperament he brought to navigation. Returning to the Corps' New Orleans office a third time was not impossible, but he had now submitted 2 maps, received no response to either, and watched a federal publication appear that incorporated his data without acknowledgement. A third submission would add a third item to the correspondence file. He did not anticipate a different outcome. He was not a man given to performing gestures he did not believe would produce results. He had, over the previous year, been in contact with a small number of men who moved at the edges of free black professional life in New Orleans, a community that was larger, more legally established, and more economically complex than most Americans outside Louisiana understood. There were free black property owners in New Orleans, free black businessmen, free black veterans of the War of 1812, whose service had been formally recognized by Andrew Jackson. There were, in that community, a very small number of men who had navigated American legal and institutional frameworks successfully enough to leave a documented trail. Through one of them, a man named Celestin Thierry, a free black notary whose practice operated near the Treme district. Solomon had the map formally notarized in June of 1844. Thierry examined the document, examined the associated notebook pages, and issued a notarial certificate attesting to the date of the document's execution and his examination of its contents. The certificate noted that the signatory, Solomon Pace, had demonstrated prior provenance through the dated notebook entries and had presented testimony from 2 river pilots, Cutter among them, confirming the map's construction history. It was not a legal claim. It was not a copyright filing. It was the only official documentation available to a man in his position. A formal record made at cost by a credentialed professional at a time when formal records by credentialed professionals were the closest approximation of legal standing that the law permitted him to hold. Thierry had a secondary observation. He told Solomon at the end of their meeting that the documentation was impressive and the case was straightforward, and that, in his experience, none of that would be sufficient. What would be sufficient? Solomon asked. Thierry picked up his pen. A witness with standing, he said. Someone who can speak in a room where they don't require you to produce a certificate before they'll let you through the door. Solomon left the notary's office with a legally certified copy of his map and the clearer understanding that legal certification was not the same as legal power. He was 39 years old. The river was still running. Boats were still going down on the same snags his map marked in red ink. And Drummond's chart, which covered 37 of those locations adequately and missed 54 entirely, was now the official federal navigation document for that water. He went back to Natchez and kept working. The years between 1844 and 1849 were not years of idleness. Solomon continued to pilot, continued to sound, continued to update the map that no government authority had chosen to recognize. He refined the notation system further, developing a 3-tier classification for obstruction permanence that distinguished between year-round anchored snags, seasonal accumulations that cleared in high water years, and mobile sediment bars whose positions needed to be re-verified at intervals of no more than 6 months. He added 15 new locations between 1844 and 1847. He removed 4 that successive soundings suggested had cleared. He continued sharing excerpts with pilots he trusted. The informal distribution network had grown. By 1845, copies of various sections circulated among perhaps 20 working pilots on the lower Mississippi. None of them official, all of them used. Men compared notes. 2 pilots who had not previously met recognized the same notation convention on their separately acquired copies and understood without being told that they were working from the same source document. One of them, a man named Thibodeau, who ran a small freight operation out of Baton Rouge, sent Solomon a letter in the autumn of 1845, noting that his copy of the Ellis Cliffs section had, in his estimation, saved him from a collision in October of that year that might otherwise have taken his boat. He wrote, "I do not know how to calculate the value of what you have made, but I know that the James Coulter and the Eliza Coburn and the boats I do not know the names of are the price that was paid for it. And that price ought to have been paid by someone who had the authority and the money to pay it, instead of by you." Solomon filed the letter inside the oilskin pouch, with the map, the notarial certificate, and his freedom papers. He added Thibodeau's position report to the Ellis Cliffs section. The river did not stop taking boats. Between 1844 and 1850, the Army Corps' Lower Mississippi District recorded 43 additional snag-related vessel losses on the stretch of river Solomon's map covered. Of those 43, his own accounting identified at least 19 that involved hazard locations he had documented. Drummond's chart, its deficiencies invisible to anyone who did not have a more accurate document to compare it against, remained the operational federal standard. One of those 43 losses occurred in the spring of 1847, on the same deep bend above Rodney Landing, where the Providence II had gone down in 1834. A flatboat carrying 800 bushels of corn struck a submerged obstruction and sank in shallow water. The crew survived. The cargo was total loss. The incident was reported to the Corps and filed. The hazard at Rodney Landing Bend appeared on Solomon's map. It did not appear on Drummond's. The Army Corps made no modification to its chart following the 1847 loss. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the sustained effort of maintaining clarity in the face of institutional opacity. Solomon Pace was the kind of man who responded to this variety of exhaustion, not by rest, but by intensification, by making the document more complete, more precise, more resistant to the argument that its deficiencies justified its dismissal. If they had ignored it because it was informal, he formalized it. If they had ignored it because it lacked a notarial seal, he obtained a notarial seal. If they had ignored it because the source was a single man, he incorporated the verified observations of 20 men. There was nothing more he could make it. It was the most accurate survey of that water that existed. It had been so for at least 4 years. And in April of 1848, at the age of 43, he did something he hadn't done before. He wrote a letter, not to the Army Corps, but directly to the office of Senator Solomon Downs of Louisiana, who sat on the Committee on Commerce and had the previous session introduced a new resolution calling for expanded Western River survey work. The letter was 4 pages. It described his survey history, his methodology, his 2 previous Corps submissions, and the publication of Drummond's chart. It did not accuse anyone of deliberate wrongdoing. It stated in precise and measured language that the federal navigation chart for the lower Mississippi between Natchez and the vicinity of Vicksburg was demonstrably less complete than a private survey document that had been in the Corps' possession since 1841, and that at least 19 documented vessel losses since the chart's publication had occurred at locations the chart did not mark, but the private survey had. It requested that the Senator's office direct the Corps to review both documents and produce an explanation for the discrepancy. He carried the letter to a postal agent in Natchez on a Tuesday morning. He carried his freedom certificate. He received no reply. In the narrative of other men's lives, this would have been the moment of collapse, of bitterness assumed to be inevitable. Solomon Pace was not built that way, which is perhaps the most difficult thing about him to convey accurately. Not his technical achievement, which was remarkable, but his refusal over 2 decades to conflate the absence of acknowledgement with the absence of truth. He knew what the map was. He knew what it demonstrated. No amount of institutional silence changed the arithmetic of the river. He folded his copy of the letter into the oilskin pouch and went back to the water. He died in Natchez on February 19th, 1851, from a fever that developed after an early season flooding survey of the Providence II Bend. He had been trying to reposition with greater precision. He was 45 years old. He had been working the lower Mississippi for 32 years. He had built a survey instrument that marked 93 confirmed river hazards across 115 miles of the most commercially active freshwater corridor in North America. He left behind the oilskin pouch, a small amount of savings, and a document that no one with institutional authority had ever officially read. The pouch passed to a man named Henry Favrot, a free Black Natchez dock operator, who had been Solomon's closest associate in the final years, and who understood, without needing it explained, what the contents represented. Favrot kept it. When he died, In 1871, it passed to his daughter. She kept it inside the wall of a storage space in a river warehouse on Canal Street, Natchez, packed in cloth, placed in a fitted cavity behind a loose board, in the manner of a man who understood that the formal institutions of the society he lived in were not to be trusted with its preservation. The warehouse changed hands 4 times between 1871 and 1962. Nobody opened the cavity. Nobody knew to look. And Drummond's chart, which covered 74 positions to Solomon's 93, which missed 19 locations where boats went down, which had been produced in 14 months, from a combination of 34 field days and 2 submitted maps that no one in the Corps publicly acknowledged, remained the federal navigation standard for the lower Mississippi corridor until 1889, when a more comprehensive Corps survey finally superseded it. 45 years. Solomon Pace built a better instrument. They used his work without his name and told themselves the river had been properly surveyed. The river kept its own account. The demolition of the Canal Street warehouse in Natchez began on a Wednesday morning in March 1962. The building had been vacant for 11 years. The city had condemned it 2 years prior, following a structural inspection that identified significant deterioration of the rear load-bearing wall. A small crew of 4 men was contracted to strip the interior before the outer walls came down. The man who found the pouch was a laborer named Dupree, James Dupree, 38 years old, who had been working demolition and construction in Natchez since 1949. He was removing interior wall boards from a ground floor storage room when his pry bar caught on something behind the paneling. He pulled the board away, looked into the cavity, and found a cloth-wrapped bundle approximately the size of a folded newspaper, held together by a length of braided cord that had gone stiff with age. He set it on a windowsill and finished the wall section. Then he opened it. Inside the cloth was an oilskin pouch, waterproofed, double-folded, sealed at the opening with a second cord. Inside the pouch, a document written on 4 sheets of heavy paper, folded in quarters, a smaller document with an official seal, a notebook with a cracked spine and approximately 80 pages of close handwriting, a certificate, slightly water-damaged at one corner, with a government seal and a magistrate's signature, and a notarial certificate issued in New Orleans, June 1844, attesting to the examination of a map document and its contents. Dupree could not immediately determine what he was looking at. He recognized the Freedom Certificate for what it was because he understood the history it represented. His grandmother had described their equivalent, a different document, a different generation, the same constant requirement. He set that carefully aside. He looked at the map next. It was dated February 14th, 1844. At the bottom of the 4th sheet, in a precise and firm hand, Solomon Pace, Natchez, Adams County, Mississippi. River pilot, free man. Dupree took the pouch to his foreman. The foreman called the city. The city called the Natchez Historical Society, which contacted the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, which dispatched a records examiner within 72 hours. Her name was Eleanor Gadsden, and she was the only trained archivist within a reasonable distance who was also a licensed hydrographic document specialist. A coincidence that would prove consequential, because she understood, within approximately 4 hours of examining the documents, exactly what she was holding. She recognized the notation system. She had written a graduate thesis 7 years earlier on federal hydrographic survey methodology in the antebellum American West. And she had encountered Drummond's 1844 chart in that research. She knew its structure. She knew its conventions. She recognized them, imperfectly mirrored, in the document on the table in front of her. Except that the document on the table predated Drummond's chart by 11 months, according to its own date, and carried a notarial certification that placed it under professional witness in June of 1844, 3 months after Drummond's publication. She spent the rest of that week making comparisons she was not confident she had any precedent for making, cross-referencing two 120-year-old navigation documents against each other and against historical vessel loss records, required source material she did not have in Natchez. She photographed every page of the map in the notebook and drove to New Orleans the following Monday. The Army Corps of Engineers maintained a district historical archive in New Orleans that contained records going back to the early 1800s. Gadsden requested access to the Lower Mississippi correspondence files for the years 1840 through 1846. The archivist on duty brought her 4 boxes. She found Hargrove's intake log for August 1840. It listed, among other items, one entry dated August 19th. Submitted private navigation survey, Lower Mississippi, Natchez to Vicksburg, various. Filed for Major Calloway's attention. No follow-up notation. She found the intake log for April 1841. One entry dated April 24th. Second submission, survey document, same origin as August 1840 file. Lieutenant Ashford received submitting party. She found Ashford's briefcase note, written on a half sheet and stored with the April 1841 file. It read, reviewed hand survey, Lower Mississippi corridor, 64 positions marked. Methodology, dead reckoning, lead line sounding, pilot testimony cross-reference. Accuracy within 50 to 100 yards per submitter's estimate. No instrument survey conducted. Referred to Major Calloway. Note, submitting party is a free colored man, Natchez. Map appears competent. Map appears competent. Ashford had written that in April 1841. Drummond's chart had been published in March 1844. In the same box as Ashford's note, Gadsden found a memorandum dated November 28, 1842, the month Drummond arrived in New Orleans. It was addressed from the district administrative office to Drummond's attention, directing him to complete a comprehensive Snag documentation for the lower corridor, utilizing all available district resources in compliance with the Senate's 24-month resolution directive. The phrase all available district resources was underlined, not in the original ink, in a different ink, slightly darker, added later. She photographed the memorandum. She photographed the underlined phrase. She sat for a long time in the archive room with the photographs beside her. She could not prove who had underlined those 3 words, or when. She could not prove that Drummond had personally reviewed the submitted maps. The chain of custody between Hargrove's intake log, Ashford's case note, the Magazine Street storage room, and Drummond's preparation of his 1844 chart was inferential, documented in its individual links, but not in the connections between them. The Corps' internal records from 1842 and 1843, the period during which Drummond would have been drawing on available material, were incomplete. A fire in the Magazine Street facility in 1891 had destroyed portions of the storage archive. Whether that fire had destroyed the originals of Solomon's 2 submitted maps could not be determined. What could be determined, what the documents established with certainty, was this. Solomon Pace had submitted a survey of the lower Mississippi to the Army Corps of Engineers in August 1840. He had submitted an updated version in April 1841. Both submissions had been received and filed. A Corps officer had reviewed at least one of them in April 1841 and recorded it as competent. No formal response had been provided to the submitter. In March 1844, the Corps had published a chart covering the same river corridor, authored by a lieutenant who had been in the district for 14 months and had conducted 34 days of direct field work, insufficient time to produce the coverage the chart claimed. 37 of the chart's 74 marked positions corresponded within navigational tolerances to positions marked on Solomon Pace's February 1844 map. Solomon Pace's map bore a notarial certification predating the chart's publication by 11 months. Solomon Pace's map marked 93 positions. Drummond's chart marked 74. Solomon Pace's name appeared nowhere in any Corps document except as submitting party, and once as a free colored man, Natchez. Gadsden published her initial findings in the Journal of Mississippi History in the autumn of 1963. The paper was titled An Antebellum River Survey and its federal analog, the Pace Documents and the Drummond Chart of 1844. It was 22 pages long, densely footnoted, and written in the careful language of archival scholarship. Language that qualified its conclusions precisely to the weight of its evidence and no further. The response within the historical community was immediate and, for an academic journal, unusually pointed. Within 18 months, 3 other historians had published responses, 2 of them extending Gadsden's analysis, one challenging her positional cross-referencing methodology. The challenger's paper contained one significant error. He had compared Drummond's chart against a photographic reproduction of Solomon's map that had been slightly rescaled during processing, introducing a systematic offset. When corrected, his positional comparison actually strengthened Gadsden's original correlation figures. He published a correction. The amended numbers confirmed 39 matching positions, not 37. The Army Corps of Engineers issued no statement on Gadsden's findings in 1963 or in any subsequent year. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History formally acquired the Pace documents in 1964. They were cataloged, conserved, and placed in climate-controlled storage. The original map, 4 sheets of heavy paper, hand-lettered in a firm and precise hand. The notation system explained in the legend Solomon had written on the morning of February 14th, 1844, was given its own archival container. The Freedom Certificate was cataloged separately. It noted Solomon Pace's birth in Natchez in 1805 and his status as a free man recognized by Adams County. The magistrate who signed it was named Whitfield. What the record does not contain is equally precise. No record survives of Solomon Pace being told his work was received. No record survives of anyone in the Army Corps writing to Natchez to ask a follow-up question, request a meeting, or acknowledge a submission. No record survives of any internal Corps discussion. in any document recovered from any archive that mentions Solomon Pace by name in connection with navigation survey work. He appears twice in federal documentation, both times as a category, not a person. What the record does contain: 2 letters in Solomon's own hand, transcribed in his notebook from drafts he kept. One to the Corps District Office in 1840, accompanying the first map. It is formal, precise, and free of supplication. It describes his qualifications, his methodology, and his purpose. It ends: I present this survey in the expectation that the Corps' stated commitment to the safety of navigation on the federal waters of the lower Mississippi will be served by its consideration. Solomon Pace, River Pilot. The second letter, the one to Senator Downs' office in 1848, is longer. It maintains the same register: precise, evidence-based, unaccusatory. But in the final paragraph, the register shifts slightly. It reads, I am aware that this communication may be regarded, given the nature of our society, as improbable in its source. I submit it regardless, because the arithmetic of the river does not adjust itself to suit the expectations of those who have chosen not to look at it carefully. The boats go down. The locations are known. The current survey does not mark them. These facts do not depend on the standing of the man who assembled them. He was 43 years old when he wrote that. He had been building reliable knowledge for 20 years. He had submitted it twice, certified it once, distributed it informally to the 20 men who used it to avoid losing votes, and written to a U.S. senator about it. He had done everything available to him in the American legal and institutional framework of 1848, which is to say he had done things whose inadequacy was built into the framework itself. He was not bitter in the letter. He was precise. The distinction matters. Eleanor Gadsden died in 2009 at the age of 83. Her 1963 paper remained in print through 4 reprints over the following 4 decades and was included in the University Press of Mississippi's 1994 anthology on antebellum river economy and labor. In 2001, a historical marker was proposed for the Natchez waterfront to note Solomon Pace's contribution to lower Mississippi navigation history. The proposal moved through the Mississippi Historical Markers Committee over a period of 4 years and was eventually approved. The marker was installed in the spring of 2006 on a brick surface at the south end of the Canal Street landing, 12 blocks from the warehouse where James Dupree had found the oilskin pouch 44 years earlier. The marker is bronze. It reads, in part, Solomon Pace, 1805 to 1851, river pilot and self-taught surveyor, compiled the most complete navigation survey of the lower Mississippi River between Natchez and Vicksburg, produced by any single individual in the antebellum period. His original map, dated February 14, 1844, preceded by 11 months the Federal Navigation Chart for the same corridor. His surveys were submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers and received without official response. The work he produced, and was never credited for, guided commercial river traffic on the lower Mississippi for years after his death. James Dupree was still alive in 2006. He attended the marker installation. He was 82 years old, and he stood in the April light on the Natchez waterfront with his hands folded in front of him, while a city official read from prepared remarks. And then he stood there a while longer after the official speech was done, looking at the river Someone asked him afterward what he remembered finding. He said, "A man who wrote things down because he knew they were true. Didn't write them down because someone was going to pay attention. Wrote them down because not writing them down would have been a lie." He paused. "The river's still there," he said. "The snags are still there. He mapped them. That's what he did." Consider what the oilskin pouch contained: a freedom certificate, worn at the folds, a notebook filled with measurements, a notarized map, letters that received no replies. The complete intellectual output of a man who spent 3 decades measuring something precisely because everyone with institutional authority had declined to do it, and who then had his precision extracted, anonymized, and published under another man's name while he was still alive and working 20 miles away. There is no record that Solomon Pace ever knew whether anyone had read his letters. There is no record that he ever received a single official communication from any government body acknowledging his existence as someone who had done something worth acknowledging. The river took 5 of his boats. The government took his work. He kept sounding depths he was not paid to measure in water that was not safe to navigate, charting hazards that were going to sink boats whether or not he recorded them. And here's the detail that does not leave easily. When Eleanor Gadsden compared Solomon's 1844 map against Drummond's 1844 chart, she found that Solomon's positions were, on average, more accurate. Not substantially. The difference was within the margin of instrument error for both documents. But when she and 2 colleagues independently compared both maps against physical survey data collected in 1961 for a core dredging project, the closest available ground truth data set, Solomon's hand-drawn, knotted rope, dead reckoning map was a measurably better document than the federal chart produced with transit instruments, a trained draftsman, and the full authority of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. 37 positions. Better accuracy. No instruments. 11 months earlier. He had done it with a rope and a sinker and 20 years of attention to a river that he knew better than anyone who had ever been paid to know it. The map is still in the Mississippi Department of Archives. You can request to see it. It is housed in a flat storage archival container, climate-controlled, cataloged by accession number. The handwriting is clear. The notation system is precise. The legend, written across the bottom of the 4th sheet, explains every symbol in methodical order. At the top of the 1st sheet, in the same hand, above the title and the river coordinates and the date, a single line. This is an accurate account of what is there. That is what Solomon Pace wrote. That is all he wrote. He was right.